Hello, I'm Reed Malcolm, Executive Editor of Asian Studies at the University of California Press. Today, it's my great pleasure to be speaking with Roger Garside, author of the highly acclaimed book, Coming Alive, China After Mao, and also his new book with UC Press entitled China Coup, The Great Leap to Freedom. In this new book, Garside makes the prediction that, contrary to the prevailing consensus, China's leader, Xi Jinping, will soon be removed from office in a coup d'etat mounted by rivals among his own leadership. Garside calls for the US and its allies to make regime change its highest priority in terms of its own China strategy. While the US cannot dictate how China is ruled, they can engineer certain conditions which might embolden and enable the rivals of Xi to remove him from office, while at the same time watching their own transition to democracy. Garside shows why this must be done. He shows how it can be done and how it can be successful. He draws on his deep knowledge of Chinese history, politics, and economics, first to develop a scenario of how things might unfold. And then in the main body of the book, he shows readers why. This is a gripping, pervasive account and a real page turner. So Roger Garside, thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Reed, for inviting me to meet you. It's a great pleasure.
So first off, I'm just curious to know more about your history, both personal and professional. How did you become interested in China?
I was commissioned into the British Army, the Brigade of Gurkhas, recruited in Nepal, and posted to Hong Kong. I was a conscript, but I was an officer. And in 1958, 60 years ago or more, I watched China across the Hong Kong-China border through a pair of military binoculars. And at that stage, Mao was running his disastrous Great Leap Forward. Mao's Great Famine killed 46 million people prematurely. And I became fascinated with China and what the hell was going on in that then very close land across the border. And that fascination has never left me.
Wonderful. Well, I know you've worked as a diplomat and a development banker, capital market development advisor. How have these experiences shaped your understanding of China?
Well, the time I spent in China, 7 years in all for the diplomatic service, if you include my 2 years study in Hong Kong of Mandarin, taught me that the Chinese regime is very proficient at developing a narrative about what's going on in China, and through multiple channels spreading that narrative across the world. But if you are to get at the truth of what's happening in China, you need to learn to look way beyond that narrative into the nitty-gritty of life on the ground, or putting scholarly work together. And my many years in China, I think, have given me the ability to do that. But my career has stretched, as you said, to include development banking, capital market advisory work in the countries undergoing transition from the command economy to the market economy. I worked in Hungary, Russia, Vietnam, Tanzania, on the front line of social and economic change in Europe and the third world. And what I learned from all of that is that, as Winston Churchill said, there's no perfect system of government yet been tried, but the least bad one that has been tried is democracy, by which I've come to see that it's not just a matter of elections, but the rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of association, free markets, an independent judiciary, all these things inextricably linked. And I know from my research that there are many people in the high reaches of the Communist Party who understand that their own system has really run out of road. And is incapable of solving the very problems to which it has given rise. And they need a change of system. And the only sensible change is to democracy.
I would imagine that dissenting view is quite dangerous.
Well, it would be if I was Chinese and living in China.
Well, not for you, but for those within the government.
Right. And so they keep very quiet. It would be plenty of people have gone to jail for expressing precisely those views. And but it doesn't mean to say that they are not held. And there is evidence which I detail in my book to show that those views are held even within the regime, within the Communist Party.
You know, China's growing in wealth and power every year, and the grip of the Communist Party looks pretty much unshakable, at least to most outsiders. And yet you devote a quarter of your book to telling the story of a coup to remove Xi Jinping and launch a transition to democracy, which makes it seem like a not too unfathomable scenario. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is a regime which is outwardly strong, but inwardly weak. This is a regime which is not authoritarian, as so many commentators describe it. That's a lazy euphemism. This regime is totalitarian, and it is very good at control, but there's no basis of trust between it and the people that it rules. There's no trust and no truth in China. And that is not a sound basis for government. It doesn't breed self-confidence in government. The fact is that since 2011, this supposedly self-confident regime has been spending more resources, devoting a higher budget to internal security than to the military, which means that it's more afraid of discontent internally than it is of its foreign enemies. That's not a sign of a confident regime.
Right. So in the book, you call for the US and its allies to adopt a regime change as its highest policy goal.
Yeah.
Some might call this dangerous, some might call it unrealistic, maybe even imperialistic. Yeah. Any thoughts about that?
Sure. Dangerous? Yes. I mean, it's a risky strategy, but far greater risk lies in doing nothing, in adopting a passive attitude or a defensive attitude towards what is now the second largest economy in the world, and which could become the largest economy in the world, ruled by a totalitarian regime. That is a nightmare thought. And we have got to develop a strategy for making sure that that nightmare does not come to reality. Now, how can we do that? The US and its allies have economic superiority over the People's Republic of China. We control the world's biggest capital market, the world's biggest pool of capital. In the US dollar, you have the world's major reserve currency, and you control the world's banking system. These are enormous strengths. And we, with you, have the greatest resources for scientific and technological discovery and innovation. China has benefited enormously from access to all of these. And what we need to do is to develop a strategy in which we use these strengths to incentivize change in China and sanction continuation along the present course. Because we look back over the last 12, 24 months, look at the genocide in Xinjiang, look at the suppression of freedom in Hong Kong, look at the military threats to Taiwan. Is this a regime we want to share our future with?
You know, there are a lot of people, a lot of folks throughout the world who see America as a declining world power, you know, dealing with its own social and political unrest, let alone, you know, the problems of the pandemic. What leverage do you think the U.S. has, the U.S. and its allies, over China today, and how can they apply this leverage to help those Chinese who want regime change and want to achieve it?
Well, as you said earlier, we should not try and dictate to China what kind of how it is governed, but we should be working to create conditions in which those within China who want change can achieve it. And I've mentioned the economic strengths that we have and which the US has begun to apply. I mean, and under Trump, the Chinese access to technology with military applications, a start has been made on restricting that. Very important. The restrictions on Huawei, just to take one company, have been devastating for that company. The Congress passed legislation unanimously, signed off by Trump in his last days, which will deny access to the US securities markets to Chinese companies, or indeed companies from every country, any country, which do not allow the US regulatory authorities to have access to the financial information which US law says they must have access. That access has been denied for years by the Chinese regime, by the communist regime, which has passed a law preventing Chinese companies from supplying that information. And in my book, I base my narrative of the coup d'etat around a confrontation developed by the US using that denial of access to the US capital market to create a confrontation and crisis in Chinese capital markets, which the pro-democracy plotters then capitalize on. So that's just one way I have imagined it could happen. But as I've come nearer to publication date, I have seen the US realities catch up with what I imagined. Sometimes I'm a bit nervous that they might overtake what I have imagined.
Interesting, interesting. So is there any one thing you hope readers will take away from your book?
Yes, a an awakening of the imagination and a reconsideration of preconceived ideas, awakening of the imagination as to the possibilities of our working to help bring change to China. A possibility that working to make sure that the future is not just an extension of the present and the past.
Wonderful. Well, once again, the book is China Coup, The Great Leap to Freedom. The author is Roger Garside. Roger, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you for your excellent questions.